Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
The last time I wore a dress was at my mother's funeral, and even then, I sat in the back. Nobody told me to, but you learn over the years where you belong in a family that only calls when someone dies or gets married. This time, it was a wedding. My younger sister Jen's wedding, to be exact. And when I got the invitation, tucked in a plain white envelope with the return address of our childhood home, I stared at it for a long time, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. We hadn't spoken in 6 years, not since the Thanksgiving blow-up, where I told her, quietly but clearly, that I was done being the backdrop to her picture-perfect life. Back then, she just smirked and said, "You were never in the picture to begin with." Still, I came. Not because I wanted to mend anything or because I was moved by the printed, "We hope you'll honor us with your presence." No, I came because I needed to see for myself the lie she was selling to the world. And maybe, just maybe, find out what kept rotting inside me since we were kids. I wore navy slacks and a simple cream blouse, the kind that wouldn't scream, "Look at me," but wouldn't whisper "forgotten relative" either. I pulled into the venue's gravel parking lot 10 minutes before the ceremony, sat in the car, and watched as couples in pastel dresses and rented tuxes swarmed toward the glass doors like moths chasing fake light. My name was on the guest list. No +1. Inside, the chapel was dressed to impress. Strings of fairy lights, floral arches, monogrammed napkins. Jen had always been good at curating fantasy. I slipped into the back row without drawing attention, folding my hands in my lap, feeling that familiar smallness creep up my spine. The music hadn't started yet. Guests were still greeting each other, kissing cheeks, exchanging laughs that belonged in another life. I hadn't been there 5 minutes before I felt her perfume before I saw her. Jen. Lavender and something sharp, like citrus. She approached with that same magazine cover smile she's used since high school. Her hair curled into perfection, makeup like a Pinterest tutorial. She bent slightly to my level, lowered her voice just enough to be polite, and said, "You're sitting at the back?" Then her eyes narrowed just a little, not enough for others to notice, and she added, "Real guests go up front." I looked at her, my baby sister in a designer gown, standing in the glow of her curated fairy tale, and every word I wanted to say, every time I'd bitten my tongue growing up, flickered behind my teeth. But I said nothing, just gave a small, neutral nod, the kind soldiers give each other in silence, and turned my eyes back to the altar. She hovered a moment longer, waiting for something, an apology maybe, or a compliment, but I wasn't giving her either. Eventually, she sighed and walked off, heels clicking in sharp, rehearsed rhythm. That moment should have ended there. Me in the back, invisible, her in the front, celebrated. Story of our lives. But then the music shifted. The soft ambient strings faded into a sharper, more orchestral swell, the kind of transition that meant the bridal party was taking their places. I stood, out of instinct or habit, ready to fade into the background and let the pageantry roll forward. That's when a tall man in a well-cut tux turned halfway toward me. I recognized him immediately, even though I hadn't seen him in over a decade. Tobias Hayes. He used to be one of my ROTC students, back when I was still running training programs in Colorado Springs. Back then, he was all limbs and awkward ambition. Now he looked like something out of a recruitment ad, broad-shouldered, calm, composed, with a voice that could level a room. "Major," he said, not loudly, but firmly, heads turned. "The couple would be honored if you took the front row." For a second, I thought I misheard. Or maybe he was talking to someone else. But no, his eyes were on me, and he wasn't smiling. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. A command almost, one that said, "You earned this." One that reminded me of who I had been before I let this family convince me I was nothing. Jen was already at the altar, pretending not to see what was happening, but I saw the twitch in her jaw, the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips. I stood, slowly, deliberately. I could feel the air shift as I made my way past the rows of well-dressed strangers, some giving curious looks, others pretending not to care. The front row was pristine, marked with delicate gold cards, mother of the bride, father of the groom, and now, suddenly, Major Margaret Claire Bennett. Someone had placed the nameplate just minutes before. As I sat, I felt it. Not vindication exactly, but something quieter, something earned. I didn't plan this, I didn't ask for it. But now I was in the front row, and Jen would have to say her vows, knowing I was there, seeing it all, unmoved, unbroken, and no longer in the background. And maybe that's what really scared her. But let me ask you something, and think about this before you type out your comment. What would you do if someone who treated you like a stranger for years suddenly needed you front and center for their show? Would you stay quiet and let them use your face for their narrative? Or would you finally remind them that you were never the supporting character in their story? Because as the music swelled and Tobias stepped back to take his place as best man, I realized something. I wasn't here to celebrate Jen. I was here to watch it all unfold, and maybe, just maybe, to flip the script when the moment was right. The thing about being noticed after years of being deliberately ignored is that it doesn't feel like justice. It feels like strategy, like someone pulled you out of the dark, not because they missed you, but because they needed you to complete some curated image, some illusion of unity. And suddenly I wasn't just the sister who hadn't been around. I was the Major, a title I never flaunted in civilian spaces, especially not among people who never gave a damn about what it cost me to earn it. When Tobias called me forward with that voice, firm, confident, and far too precise to be improvised, I had a choice to make, and I made it slowly, deliberately, feeling each step echo against the pristine floor, not because I needed attention, but because I wanted her to feel every second of it. I took that front row seat not because I forgave her, not because I believed in some last-minute olive branch, but because I knew my presence up front changed the geometry of the entire room. From the back, I was invisible. From the front, I was undeniable. I sat down, folding my hands across my lap, the way I used to before every boardroom briefing, every strategy meeting, every time someone questioned whether I really belonged. My name card had been handwritten, not printed like the others, and that told me this wasn't part of the original plan. This wasn't Jen's doing. This was someone else, inserting a variable into her carefully balanced equation. The ceremony began, with vows that sounded like they'd been pulled from a wedding blog, generic promises and soft metaphors about forever, but all I could focus on was the quiet ripple that ran through the crowd, the occasional glance my way from people who recognized me and weren't sure if they should greet me, pretend not to see me, or ask if I was the woman who used to live in the guest room upstairs, the one Jen always described as off doing military things. Tobias stood there like a statue, holding the rings, but I caught him watching me more than once, not in a flirtatious way, not even with nostalgia, but with something cooler, more calculating, like he was checking that I was still following the path he had quietly laid out. After the ceremony, during the photos, I stayed seated while the rest of the guests were herded toward the reception hall. I didn't want to be in the pictures. I didn't want to stand beside people who once told me I'd changed after deployment, as if trauma was optional and service was a personality quirk. I didn't want to smile next to a sister who, the last time we spoke, said I was impossible to love because I was always trying to lead instead of follow. And yet there was Tobias, walking back toward me, the way soldiers walk when they're about to ask something personal, but don't want to admit they care. He didn't sit, just stood at an angle beside me and said, "I hope you don't mind. I told them you deserved that seat." I didn't answer right away because the truth is, I didn't know what to make of him. The last time I saw Tobias, he was 20, scrawny, idealistic, and scared shitless before his first solo assessment. He'd called me ma'am even when I told him not to, always asking for feedback, always hungry for approval. But the man in front of me now wasn't the same kid. His voice was steadier, but not cold, just measured, like he'd learned how to speak in a room where no one listens until you force them to. "You look good," he said, and I gave him a side glance that made it clear I wasn't here for compliments. He smirked a little, but then he added, more quietly, "I'm sorry for how they treated you back then." That stopped me, not because I hadn't heard apologies before, but because no one from this world had ever acknowledged it. Not the lies Jen spread after I moved out. Not the Thanksgiving ambush where I was accused of being bitter. Not the years of radio silence. I looked at him, really looked, and asked the only question that mattered. Why now? He shifted slightly, tugging at the cuff of his jacket, and then said, "Because I saw the guest list, and I saw who wasn't on it. I knew you'd show up anyway. You always show up, even when they act like you don't matter." He paused, his gaze flicking toward the photo crowd, where Jen was laughing in her perfect white dress. "I wanted her to know that someone else saw you, someone who remembers." I didn't say thank you. I just nodded, which in our world meant more. It meant I see you too. The reception was starting, and I followed him in, not because I wanted to celebrate her, but because I was beginning to suspect that Tobias had placed me here for a reason far bigger than symbolic seating. Something was off, and I could feel it building like static under my skin. And when I walked into that ballroom, with its gold-draped tables and crystal centerpieces, I saw my name again, this time on the seating chart, written in bold letters under a sign that read, "Family Head Table." My stomach twisted. That was not a place you put someone out of politeness. That was a statement. But whose? The thing about weddings, especially ones choreographed down to the last bow on a napkin ring, is that they are designed not for honesty, but for optics, not for truth, but for narrative. And as I took my place at the so-called family head table, my name etched in gold script on a thick cardstock, flanked by people who had once called me too cold to love and too blunt to bring to holiday dinners, I realized that this was no longer just a celebration of two people pledging their lives to each other, but a performance built on revisions and omissions, a pageant where I had somehow been handed a role without auditioning, or perhaps without consent. The chair to my left was empty, meant presumably for my mother, who was already seated with Jen's new in-laws, smiling that tight-lipped smile that never quite reached her eyes. The same smile she wore when I told her, at 19, that I was enlisting instead of finishing college. The same smile she had on the day I returned home from my second deployment with a shoulder injury and a hardened voice. Around me, laughter erupted in bursts, warm, rehearsed, artificial, like sound effects on a sitcom that never changed its punchlines. Jen's new husband, a man I had met only once and remembered solely as someone who complimented my posture in a way that felt vaguely insulting, stood at the microphone and began his welcome speech, thanking everyone for coming, making jokes about marriage being a team sport, sprinkling in safe anecdotes that drew polite laughter but left no trace. It was all polished, all expected, all incredibly hollow. And yet I couldn't stop watching Jen. She stood at the center of it all, glowing in that curated, camera-ready way she had perfected since she was a teenager, when our father used to call her his little movie star, and I, despite bringing home straight A's and never missing curfew, was merely the other one, dependable but unremarkable, necessary but never adored. Jen's gown was sleek, expensive, probably picked out during one of those bridal weekends she used to post about, surrounded by bridesmaids and champagne flutes, none of whom I recognized or could name. She looked like the picture of a woman who had won something, maybe everything, and yet her eyes, whenever they flicked in my direction, betrayed just a flicker of tension, like she couldn't quite believe I was still sitting there, quietly in a seat meant for someone she didn't expect to show up. Dinner was served, courses announced with flair, waiters gliding across the floor like stagehands in a play that took itself too seriously. I ate slowly, deliberately, the way one does when there is more to be said than to be savored. I listened to toasts. The best man, Tobias, kept his short and respectful, though when he glanced at me mid-sentence and referred to those who lead not just in title but by example, I felt a few heads turn toward me, and Jen's fingers tightened slightly on the stem of her glass. Her maid of honor, someone named Kelsey, a former college roommate, I think, spoke next, delivering a syrupy speech about Jen's loyalty and laughter, calling her the sister she never had, a phrase that landed like a slap because, of course, I was the sister she had, the one Jen pretended didn't exist when it was convenient, the one cut from family photos with the clean digital cruelty of modern editing apps. When it was Jen's turn to speak, she stood slowly, gathering her skirt with practiced grace, the microphone already adjusted to her height, her smile wide enough to reach every lens in the room. She began with gratitude, thanking guests for traveling, for dressing up, for supporting their love story, and then, almost as if it were scripted, she shifted into the mythology of our shared past. Some of you know, she began, her voice softening just enough to feign intimacy, that I grew up with a big sister who was a force. She taught me how to climb trees, how to sneak out of the house without getting caught, how to pretend we were twins even though we were 3 years apart. I froze. Every story she shared was a memory we had lived through. Yes, but every detail had been twisted just slightly, sanded down to suit the audience. Our late father described as always supportive. Our childhood full of love and laughter. As if the yelling, the slammed doors, the silent dinners hadn't happened. As if I hadn't spent most of my teen years playing the peacekeeper between a crumbling marriage and a sister who only ever cried when someone else was watching. She ended her speech with a toast, lifting her glass toward the sky and saying, "To all the people who made me who I am, especially the ones who stood by me no matter what." The applause was loud, full of clinking glasses and sentimental sighs, but my blood felt cold. I didn't expect an apology. I didn't expect her to recount the real story. The nights I stayed awake consoling her when Mom threatened to send her away to boarding school. The time I took the blame for something she did that nearly got me expelled. The way she refused to visit me after my injury because hospitals freaked her out. But I didn't expect this erasure either. And maybe that's what hurt most. Not the lies, but the effortlessness with which she told them. Tobias appeared beside me just as the plates were being cleared, slipping an envelope onto the table beside my wine glass. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and walked away, vanishing into the sea of sequins and candlelight. I stared at the envelope, plain white, no markings, and felt my stomach twist in that old familiar way. The one that used to mean trouble was coming. I slid it under the table, opened it slowly, and pulled out a single page. A photocopy of a handwritten letter, yellowed with age but still legible. The salutation stopped my breath. Dear Maggie, it was my father's handwriting. He had written me a letter I had never received, dated 3 months before he left. And Jen knew. She had kept it from me, or worse, our mother had, and Jen had gone along with it. I folded the page, slid it back into the envelope, and felt the room blur slightly as the clinking glasses continued. Laughter rising like smoke, and every smile around me felt suddenly grotesque. I had come to observe, but now I had a mission. There are moments in life, rare, still disorienting moments, when the noise of a crowded room becomes irrelevant, when the clinking of glasses and the droning of overused wedding playlists fade into the background, replaced by a quiet so sharp it hums beneath your skin. Sitting at that so-called family head table, with glittering silverware and smiling strangers on either side of me, I stared at the envelope Tobias had placed in my hand like a live wire, because even before I opened it, something inside me knew this wasn't just a sentimental token or a misguided keepsake. It was a truth I had been denied for almost 3 decades, sealed in paper that had yellowed with time and contempt. And I knew with the same certainty I used to feel when setting coordinates for a precision drop, that once I read it, something in my world, maybe everything, would no longer be the same. I didn't open it right away, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to brace for whatever kind of heartbreak waited inside. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, stubborn, always in pen. I remembered it from the notes he used to leave on the fridge when he worked the overnight shift, the way he'd write my name in capital letters when he meant it to feel special, even when it came attached to instructions or chores. The date on the letter, April 4th, 1997, hit me in the gut like a blunt object, because that was exactly 3 months before he disappeared from our lives with no warning, no calls, no forwarding address, only a 2-sentence explanation from my mother that he couldn't handle the pressure anymore, and we should stop asking questions if we wanted to move on. But I had asked, God, I had asked, over and over, and every time the answers got shorter, colder, more hostile. Eventually, I stopped asking because at some point, you learn that the people who are supposed to protect you will lie straight to your face if the truth costs them comfort. I slipped the letter from the envelope slowly, holding it beneath the table like a sacred thing, and scanned the words in long, practiced glances. It was short, no more than half a page, but it said more than any conversation I'd had with my mother or Jen in 30 years. He hadn't left because of the pressure. He hadn't vanished out of cowardice. He'd been pushed out. I'm sorry I haven't been able to see you lately, the letter began, in that patient, deliberate style he used when he knew something was about to hurt. There are things happening here that I don't think you understand yet. Your mother and sister have made it very clear that I'm no longer welcome in the house. I wanted to fight, but every time I tried, it just made things worse for you. You were always the strong one, always the truth teller. That scared them. I stopped reading, not because I couldn't go on, but because I suddenly couldn't breathe. Jen, my baby sister, who I had defended, comforted, sheltered from our parents' bitter arguments, had been part of it, not just a victim, an architect. And Mom, her silence, her contempt, all of it. It had been the armor of someone with something to hide. I read the rest of the letter in silence, finishing with the final line, which felt less like a farewell and more like a quiet benediction. I hope one day you'll understand, and if you do, I hope you forgive me. He signed it, Dad. There was no mention of Jen, no apology for leaving her, no suggestion that she had been innocent, just a single line of gratitude for me, the daughter he trusted to know the difference between being loved and being used. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from fear or sadness, but from fury so controlled it felt like a second pulse. I folded the letter back into its envelope and slipped it into my purse, sealing it not just from view, but from the reach of the people who had built their entire world on the fiction that was disposable. The reception carried on around me with oblivious cheer, people dancing, hugging, filling their plates with another round of food they wouldn't finish. But for me, the night had shifted. I was no longer a guest, no longer a reluctant witness to a carefully staged performance. I was something else now, a keeper of truth, a threat. Tobias approached quietly again, this time with a glass of water instead of wine, setting it in front of me like a truce offering. You read it, he said, not as a question, but as a certainty. I nodded, watching the way he moved, controlled, strategic, the way only someone trained to move through chaos without being seen could do. He didn't sit this time. He simply leaned closer and said, You know what you're going to do? I didn't answer him. Not because I didn't know, but because I was still sharpening the edges of what came next. Revenge, if you want to call it that, isn't about yelling or flipping tables or telling everyone in the room what they already suspect but pretend not to see. It's quieter than that. Smarter. It's about forcing someone to look in a mirror they've avoided their entire life and letting them see, really see, what's staring back. I stood up, straightened my blouse, and walked toward the DJ booth. Not with urgency, not with rage, but with the calm precision of someone stepping into her rightful place after too many years on the perimeter. The DJ looked surprised when I leaned in and said, I'd like to make a toast. He looked around, then nodded. When? Right now, I said, and he handed me the mic. I turned back toward the room, now full of dim lights and glazed over joy, and raised the microphone slowly. I didn't need to scream. I didn't even need to say my sister's name. I just needed to speak with the weight of someone who had been silent long enough. And as the music cut out and heads turned, I felt it. That shift in air, that pause in breath, that cold, rising awareness in Jen's eyes. She knew, or at least she was about to. There's a particular silence that falls over a crowd, not when someone demands attention, but when they take it without asking. When they rise with such quiet certainty, such unapologetic command, that the very air in the room seems to hesitate, unsure whether it should allow celebration to continue or brace for impact. That was the kind of silence I walked into as I stepped onto the small platform near the DJ booth, microphone in hand, eyes scanning a ballroom where no one had expected me to speak. Least of all the bride, whose expression now betrayed the first visible crack in her perfectly constructed veneer. I didn't look at Jen right away, not because I wanted to avoid her, but because I needed her to feel the slow build of dread as I lifted the mic and waited, letting the quiet swell until it was thick enough to cut with a knife. I wasn't planning on saying anything tonight, I began, my voice steady, low, unmistakably calm in a way that felt deliberate and surgical. But life has a funny way of asking for the truth when you least expect it, and I figured if there was ever a time to say something meaningful, it might as well be when people are still sober enough to remember it. A few guests chuckled, polite, confused, unsure whether this was a speech or a warning. Jen smiled too, tight-lipped, but her eyes never left mine, not for a second. I didn't glance at the envelope still tucked in my purse, the letter now folded like a secret waiting to detonate. I didn't need to. Its contents were already stitched into every word I was about to speak. I grew up in this family, just like the woman you're here to celebrate, I continued, pausing only long enough for the weight of that sentence to settle. We shared a room for 12 years, a bathroom for 5, and 1,000 little memories that would sound sweet if you didn't know how sharp some of them really were. There was no laughter this time. When people look at childhood, they tend to focus on what's easiest to remember: the birthday parties, the Christmas mornings, the scraped knees, and the bedtime stories, I said, my gaze slowly drifting across the room, catching the eyes of distant cousins, old neighbors, and former classmates who likely hadn't thought of me since I left for basic training. But what they don't talk about is the space in between, the quiet resentments, the moments you're told to keep your mouth shut for the sake of peace, the way some people are raised to shine, while others are taught to stand behind the curtain and clap politely. Jen's hands, folded in front of her bouquet, twitched slightly. I'm not going to stand up here and rewrite the story, I said. That's already been done, more than once, and frankly, I think tonight's been full of beautiful edits. But what I will say is this: there's a reason people come back, even when they've been told for years that their presence isn't needed. There's a reason someone like me sits in the back row and keeps their mouth shut until the right moment. Now I looked at Jen. And that reason is simple. The truth doesn't disappear just because you stop talking about it. It doesn't vanish just because you repaint the past with better lighting and a softer lens. It waits, patiently, until someone decides to bring it back into the room. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The groom looked confused, maybe concerned. My mother looked down at her lap. I'm proud of what I've done in my life, even the hard parts, I said, softening my tone just slightly, not because I wanted to offer peace, but because sometimes the calmest voice carries the sharpest blade. But I'm even prouder of the fact that I no longer sit quietly when people tell stories that leave out the cost of the truth. I didn't mention the letter. I didn't need to. Jen knew, my mother knew, Tobias knew, and that was enough. So here's my toast, I said, lifting the glass of water Tobias had placed in front of me earlier, clear and untouched, not wine, not champagne, just pure, unadorned water. To the people who know how to smile through silence, to the ones who remember even when they're told to forget, and to the stories that will never fit inside a photo album. I drank slowly, then set the glass down and handed the microphone back without fanfare. No applause followed, just murmurs, tension, the slow unraveling of a room that had been built on a carefully controlled narrative. I walked back to my seat, my spine straight, my footsteps measured, aware that I had just altered the course of the evening with fewer than 500 words. Jen didn't move, She didn't follow. She just stared at her untouched cake, the white frosting gleaming under the lights like a symbol of something too perfect to be real. The rest of the night moved on, as such nights do. People danced again, a little more awkwardly. The music picked up, but the energy never returned to what it had been. And I sat there quietly, knowing I hadn't ruined her wedding, not really. What I had done was force the truth back into the room, to remind everyone that the version they were clapping for wasn't the whole story. Later, when most of the guests had gone and the band was packing up, I stepped outside into the warm night air. The parking lot was nearly empty. I was about to unlock my car when I heard footsteps behind me, fast, familiar, furious. "Wait," Jen called out. I turned slowly, letting her come closer, watching the war in her eyes as she fought between screaming and begging, accusation and apology. She stopped a few feet away, her chest rising and falling, her hair beginning to fray at the edges of the illusion. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice thin, desperate, barely holding. I looked at her for a long moment. The way you look at someone not as they are, but as they've revealed themselves to be. And then I said quietly, simply, and without a trace of bitterness, "Front row's fine." I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away. Not fast, not triumphant, but clean, free. The kind of leaving that doesn't feel like escape, but return. And somewhere behind me, Jen stood alone in her dream dress, finally realizing that not every story ends with a bouquet, a kiss, and applause. Some end with silence, and some with a chair you never thought you'd have to fill.